Somewhere in the world right now, someone is settling in for the night, pulling a blanket up around their shoulders, letting their eyes go a little soft. And somewhere else, the sun is rising over a stretch of desert that has been watching human beings come and go for a very, very long time.
The Middle East. The name itself carries a kind of weight, a kind of history. It sits there in the mind like a thick old book on a shelf, something you know has a great deal inside it, something you might pick up one day when the moment feels right.
Tonight feels like the right moment, not to argue, not to solve anything, just to look back gently at the long and winding story of this part of the world, the way you might look at an old photograph, with quiet curiosity, with patience, with no particular place to be. Let's begin at the beginning, or close enough to it. Long before there were names for countries, long before there were borders drawn on any map, there was land. There was soil and river and heat. There were two rivers in particular, the Tigris and the Euphrates, that ran alongside each other for hundreds of miles through what is now Iraq, curving and bending toward the Persian Gulf like two old friends walking side by side. The land between them was called Mesopotamia. The word comes from the Greek. It means simply between the rivers. And it is here, in this warm, flat, fertile stretch of earth, that something extraordinary began to happen around 6,000 years ago. People started staying. For most of human history before this moment, people had moved. They had followed animals, followed seasons, followed the slow logic of survival across open land. But here, in this wedge of rich soil between the rivers, the ground gave back what was planted in it. The floods came and went and left behind a dark, nourishing silt. And people began to build, not just camps, not just temporary shelters, but real settlements. Villages that grew into towns, and towns that slowly, slowly grew into something that had never existed before. Cities, the city of Ur, the city of Uruk, the city of Eridu, names that are old enough to feel like something from a dream. People lived in these cities, traded in them, argued in them, wrote things down in them. They pressed small wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets, a system of writing called cuneiform, and in doing so, they preserved the first records of human commerce, human law, human mythology. Imagine holding one of those clay tablets, small enough to fit in one hand, heavy in a way that surprises you. The marks pressed into it thousands of years ago, still visible, still legible to those who know how to read them. The Sumerians were among the first people to build this world between the rivers, and after them came the Akkadians, who absorbed and built upon what the Sumerians had made, and then the Babylonians, who absorbed and built upon what the Akkadians had made. And this is how much of history works, not as a clean replacement of one thing by another, but as a slow layering, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river. The Sumerians had gods for everything, a god of the sky, a god of the wind, a goddess of love and war named Inanna, who appears in some of the oldest surviving literature ever written. There is an ancient poem about her descent into the underworld, a slow journey down through gates, at each one of which she removes an item of clothing or jewellery, arriving finally at the bottom stripped of everything. It is a poem about grief and loss and the things that happen in the dark. There were also stories about a great flood, a man who built a boat and loaded it with animals and survived while the waters rose around him. Versions of this story appear in Mesopotamian literature long before it appears in the Hebrew Bible, and historians have gently traced the connections, the way stories pass between people who live in the same river valley, who share the same vulnerability to the same flooding rivers, who are all in some sense trying to make sense of the same world. Life in a Sumerian city was organised and detailed in a way that might surprise you. There were scribes whose whole job was to write things down, lists of goods, records of transactions, letters between merchants, hymns to gods, lamentations over the fall of cities. There were schools where young scribes sat in rows and copied out texts on clay tablets, practicing the shapes of the signs until their hands knew them without thinking. Thousands of these tablets survive. They have been dug up from the soil of Iraq over the past 2 centuries and sent to museums across the world. They are sitting in storerooms right now, in London and Philadelphia and Chicago, waiting quietly to be read. Around 4,000 years ago, a king rose to power in Babylon whose name you may have heard. Hammurabi. He ruled over a large swath of Mesopotamia and is remembered today for one thing in particular: a set of laws carved into a tall stone pillar that governed everything from wages and property to marriage and inheritance. It was one of the earliest written legal codes in human history. Whether those laws were always followed, whether they were fair, whether they served everyone equally, these are questions worth sitting with quietly. But the fact of them, the fact that someone sat down and thought, there should be rules, and then put those rules somewhere permanent where everyone could see them, that is a remarkable thing. The stone pillar is still around. You can see it today in the Louvre in Paris if you ever find yourself there, standing in a quiet gallery, taller than you might expect. The Mesopotamian world was not always peaceful, of course. Empires grew and empires fell. The Assyrians rose to power from what is now northern Iraq and built one of the most powerful military forces the ancient world had ever seen. They were famous, or perhaps infamous, for their efficiency in conquest. Their armies moved methodically, their sieges were calculated, their records of victory were detailed and thorough. The Assyrian kings built great palaces, decorated with enormous stone reliefs, carvings that showed hunting scenes, battle scenes, the lives of kings and gods. Some of these reliefs are now in the British Museum in London. You can walk past them slowly if you're there and imagine the walls they once belonged to, the torchlight that once flickered across their surfaces. After the Assyrians, the Babylonians rose again. This second Babylonian empire, sometimes called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, reached its peak under a king called Nebuchadnezzar II. He's remembered for many things: for the destruction of Jerusalem, for the exile of the Jewish people into Babylon, for the legendary Hanging Gardens that may or may not have actually existed. The question of the Hanging Gardens has never quite been resolved. Ancient writers describe them in detail: terraced gardens rising above a hot and dusty city, green and lush and improbable. But no physical trace of them has ever been found. Some historians think they never existed as described. Others think they existed somewhere else entirely. The mystery sits there, gentle and unresolved, like so many things from the ancient world. And then, slowly and steadily from the east came the Persians. The Achaemenid Empire, the first great Persian empire, began its rise around 550 years before the Common Era. Under a king named Cyrus, often called Cyrus the Great, the Persians expanded outward with remarkable speed. They absorbed Media, then Lydia, then Babylon. They swept through what is now Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, and stretched all the way east into Central Asia. Cyrus had a reputation, unusual for rulers of his era, for something approaching tolerance. When he conquered Babylon, he released the Jewish people who had been held there in exile and allowed them to return to their homeland. He permitted conquered peoples to keep their customs, their languages, their religions. He presented himself not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. Whether this was genuine principle or effective political strategy is something historians have gently debated ever since. Perhaps it was both. The Persian Empire that Cyrus founded would eventually become the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from the edges of India in the east to the borders of Greece in the west. A vast, quiet stretch of land connected by roads and messengers and the slow movement of goods along trade routes. One of the great Persian achievements was something called the Royal Road, a highway stretching nearly 3,000 kilometers from Sardis in the west to Susa in the east, with way stations spaced a day's ride apart so that royal messengers could travel its full length in something like a week. A journey that would take an ordinary traveller months could be accomplished in days if you were carrying a royal dispatch. Imagine the messengers riding through those landscapes, through the green hills of Anatolia, across the flat sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, into the dry uplands of Persia, their horses breathing hard in the morning cold, the sound of hooves on stone roads built to last. The Persians were, in many ways, remarkably sophisticated administrators of difference. The empire was made up of dozens of different peoples: Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Lydians, Armenians, Bactrians, Indians, each with their own languages, their own religions, their own customs. The Persian administrative system, rather than trying to erase all of this, worked around it. Local languages were used in local administration. Local elites were incorporated into the imperial structure. The religion of the Persian rulers themselves was Zoroastrianism, a faith centered on the cosmic struggle between a good god, Ahura Mazda, and an evil spirit, Angra Mainyu. The Zoroastrian sacred fire temples, where a flame was kept perpetually burning as a symbol of the divine, were maintained with great care. Zoroastrianism is one of the world's oldest surviving religions. Small communities of Zoroastrians still exist today in Iran and India, keeping those same fires alight. Their capital, Persepolis, was a city of columns and staircases and grand ceremonial halls. Delegations came from across the known world to pay tribute. It was the kind of city that was meant to say something, to communicate through its size and its stone, the idea of order, of permanence, of civilization. The ruins of Persepolis still stand in southern Iran today. You can walk among the columns, which are tall and pale in the afternoon light. The carvings on the staircases still show rows of figures, each carrying an offering, each walking in the same direction, patient and unhurried. The Persian Empire and the Greek city-states of the West were never quite comfortable with each other. There were wars, famous wars that have been told and retold so many times they have taken on something of the quality of legend. The battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis. The names have a weight to them even now. But the conflict between Greece and Persia eventually resolved itself in a way no one might have predicted. In the 4th century before the Common Era, a young Macedonian king named Alexander moved east with an army and a remarkable certainty of purpose. Alexander, he would later be called the Great, though he was only 32 when he died, moved through Persia like something inevitable. He defeated the Persian armies at a series of battles and eventually entered Persepolis itself. Whatever happened there exactly, there are accounts of a fire, of celebration, of regret. The great empire of the Achaemenids was gone. And then Alexander kept going. He moved into Egypt, into the Levant, into what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan and India. He founded cities along the way, many of them named Alexandria after himself. The most famous of these was in Egypt, on the Mediterranean coast, a city that would become one of the great centres of learning and culture in the ancient world. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 before the Common Era, he was not yet an old man. He left no clear successor. His generals, his closest companions, divided the empire among themselves, and the centuries that followed were a complicated and often violent reshuffling of power across the whole region. Into this space came Rome. The Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire extended steadily eastward over the course of several centuries. They absorbed the kingdoms left behind by Alexander's successors. They took Egypt after the death of Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemaic rulers, in 30 before the Common Era. They controlled the Levant, including the region known as Judea, the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. Roman rule in Judea was often tense. There were uprisings, revolts, moments of violent suppression. In 70 of the Common Era, Roman forces under the general Titus besieged Jerusalem. The city was taken. The temple, the great Temple of Solomon, or rather what remained of it by that time, was destroyed. The destruction of the temple is one of those events that reverberates very far through history. It sent the Jewish people into a dispersal, a diaspora, that would last for nearly 2,000 years. Communities settled across the Mediterranean world, across Persia, across North Africa, across Europe, carrying with them their traditions, their texts, their language, their deep and specific memory of a place. There was a second great revolt, some 60 years after the first, the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 of the Common Era. The Jews of Judea rose again against Roman rule, led by a charismatic commander named Simon Bar Kokhba. The revolt was initially successful enough that a short-lived independent state was declared, coins were minted, letters were written, some of which have survived in the caves of the Judean desert and can be read today. The Romans suppressed it with enormous force. Hundreds of thousands died. Judea was renamed Syria Palestina. a name derived, some historians think, from the Philistines, an ancient people associated with the coastal lands, in what may have been a deliberate Roman effort to erase the Jewish connection to the land. The city of Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman city called Aelia Capitolina, and Jews were forbidden from entering it under pain of death. And yet Jewish life continued and flourished in its way in the Galilee and in the diaspora communities spreading across the ancient world. The oral traditions that had accumulated over centuries were written down in the great collections of rabbinic literature, the Mishnah, and later the two Talmuds, in the years and centuries after the temple's destruction. The loss of the temple had forced a transformation. Judaism without the temple, without sacrifice, without the specific geography of one place, became a religion of text and commentary, of study and interpretation, portable enough to survive anywhere. Rome's eastern frontier was never entirely stable. To the east lay Parthia, and later the Sassanid Persian Empire, a second great Persian civilization that rose in the 3rd century of the Common Era and lasted until the 7th. The border between Rome and Persia shifted back and forth over the centuries, contested and renegotiated through a long series of wars that drained both sides. The two empires fought each other, on and off for hundreds of years, and in doing so they exhausted themselves in ways neither could quite see at the time. In the early 7th century of the Common Era, something was happening in the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, in a city called Mecca, in what is now Saudi Arabia. A man named Muhammad, a merchant by trade, began receiving what he described as revelations. He spoke them aloud to those around him. Followers gathered, slowly at first, then more quickly. A new religion was taking shape, one that called for submission to a single God, for prayer, for charity, for a way of life grounded in the divine. The religion was called Islam. The word means, in Arabic, submission. Muhammad's message was not always welcomed in Mecca. He and his followers were persecuted, and in 622 of the Common Era, they made a journey north to the city of Medina. This journey, the Hijrah, is the moment from which the Islamic calendar begins to count. Muhammad died in 632, just 10 years after the Hijrah in Medina. He left behind a community of believers and a collection of revealed words, the Quran, that his followers had been writing down and memorizing. He left behind no clear instructions about who should lead after him. This question of leadership, of succession, is the root of the oldest division within Islam. Some believed leadership should pass to Muhammad's closest companion, Abu Bakr. Others believed it should pass to Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law Ali. The first group would become known as Sunni Muslims. The second would become known as Shia Muslims. The split was not merely theological, it was also political, in the way that religion and politics are often difficult to separate. And it is a division that remains present in the Middle East today, more than 14 centuries later, shaping alliances and tensions in ways both subtle and profound. In the decades following Muhammad's death, the early Islamic caliphates, the Rashidun and then the Umayyad, expanded with breathtaking speed. Arab armies moved north into the Byzantine Empire, which had inherited the eastern portion of the old Roman world. They moved northeast into the Sassanid Persian Empire, which was already weakened from its long wars with Byzantium. Within a generation, both great powers had lost enormous territory. Jerusalem fell to Arab forces in 638. Egypt fell. Persia fell. The Arab armies moved west across North Africa and eventually crossed into Spain. They moved east into Central Asia and eventually reached the borders of China and India. This was one of the fastest expansions of any empire in human history. And it was not only military, it carried with it a language, Arabic, a faith, a set of laws, a way of organizing society. The lands that had once been ruled by Persians or Byzantines were now gradually becoming something new. The Umayyad Caliphate, based in Damascus, was followed by the Abbasid Caliphate, which moved the center of power to a new city, Baghdad, founded in 762 on the banks of the Tigris River, not far from where the ancient city of Babylon had stood. Baghdad became one of the most remarkable cities in the medieval world. At its height in the 8th and 9th centuries, it was likely the largest city on earth. home to perhaps 1 million people. Its markets sold goods from across the known world. Its libraries and scholars preserved and extended the knowledge of ancient Greece, Persia, and India. The period historians sometimes call the Islamic Golden Age stretched across several centuries. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, poetry, all flourished in Baghdad and across the broader Islamic world. The words algebra, algorithm, alcohol, and many others entered European languages from Arabic during this period. The scholar Al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad in the 9th century, developed the mathematical system we now call algebra, from the Arabic al-Jabr, and introduced to the wider world the Hindu-Arabic numeral system that we still use today. The zero, which had come from India, passed through Baghdad on its way to Europe, and with it the possibility of arithmetic of a kind that the Roman numeral system had made almost impossible. Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna, was a physician and philosopher born in what is now Uzbekistan in 980, who wrote an encyclopedia of medicine so comprehensive that it was used as a standard medical text in Europe for 6 centuries. He wrote about the contagious nature of certain diseases, about the role of soil and water in spreading illness, about the importance of quarantine, ideas that would take the European medical tradition much longer to arrive at independently. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was not a single building but a scholarly institution, a collection of translators, mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers who worked together over generations to translate the accumulated knowledge of the Greek, Persian, and Indian worlds into Arabic and then extend it. It was, in a quiet way, one of the great intellectual projects in human history. There is something peaceful about that kind of transfer. Not armies, but ideas, moving across borders in the minds of travellers and translators. But empires do not stay still. The Abbasid Caliphate began to fragment in the 9th and 10th centuries as regional governors and military commanders accumulated their own power, and the caliphs in Baghdad became increasingly ceremonial figures. And then, from the northwest, came the Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II, speaking at a council in France, called upon the Christians of Europe to take up arms and march to the Holy Land, to reclaim Jerusalem, which had been under Muslim rule since 638 for Christendom. The response was larger than anyone had anticipated. Tens of thousands of people, knights, nobles, peasants, clergy, began moving eastward across Europe and then through Anatolia, what is now Turkey. They were driven by a combination of religious devotion, the promise of spiritual reward, the lure of land and wealth, and the simple fact that when large numbers of people start moving in a direction, more people tend to follow. The First Crusade reached Jerusalem in 1099. After a siege, the city was taken. The violence of those days was recorded by witnesses on both sides. It was the kind of violence that becomes part of a city's memory, that leaves marks on the way people understand themselves and each other for a very long time. A series of crusader states were established along the eastern Mediterranean coast, fragile little kingdoms in a land far from home, always somewhat precarious, surrounded by forces that would eventually reclaim what had been taken. The Crusades continued in various forms for nearly 2 centuries. There were 8 major ones and many smaller ones. Some were disastrous, some achieved little. None of them resolved the underlying question of who the land belonged to, a question that does not have a clean answer. In 1187, a Kurdish general named Saladin, who had become the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, retook Jerusalem. He did so, by the accounts of the time, with a degree of restraint unusual for the era. He allowed the Christian population to leave safely in exchange for ransom. Saladin's reputation, in both the Islamic world and eventually in Europe as well, was that of a man of honour. A skilled military commander, yes, but also someone who understood that there were limits, even in war. Whether that reputation is fully deserved is something historians continue to examine carefully, but the image of him has persisted across the centuries, which is its own kind of historical fact. And then, from the east, something arrived that changed everything. The Mongols. By the early 13th century, Genghis Khan had united the nomadic tribes of the Mongolian steppes and set them moving in all directions. His sons and grandsons continued the project. In 1258, his grandson Hulagu Khan besieged Baghdad. The fall of Baghdad in 1258 is one of those dates that historians return to again and again. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had been the symbolic centre of the Sunni Islamic world for 5 centuries, was destroyed. The last caliph was killed. The libraries, those extraordinary libraries, full of manuscripts that had preserved the learning of ancient civilizations, were burned or thrown into the Tigris River. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, that the river ran black with the ink of destroyed books. Whether or not it is literally true, it captures something of the magnitude of what was lost. The Mongol Empire was vast but not durable in the west. Hulagu's successors, the Ilkhanate, ruled Persia and Iraq for several generations, and many of them eventually converted to Islam. The Mongol presence reshaped political and cultural patterns in the region in ways that were deep and lasting. The balance of power never returned to what it had been before. In the west, in Egypt and Syria, a different power had survived. The Mamluks, a military caste of soldiers, many of them originally enslaved Central Asian Turks who had risen through the ranks to become rulers, defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. It was one of the first significant defeats of a Mongol army, and it stopped the Mongol advance into the western Middle East and Africa. The Mamluks ruled Egypt for 2.5 centuries, until they were absorbed by a new and even larger empire rising in the west, the Ottoman Empire. The name has a certain solidity to it, a certain quietness. The Ottoman Empire endured for 6 centuries, from the late 13th century to the early 20th, and at its height it controlled southeastern Europe, Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. It was founded by a dynasty of Turkish rulers beginning with a man named Osman in northwestern Anatolia in the late 1200s. Over the generations that followed, the empire expanded steadily, absorbing the remnants of the Byzantine Empire and eventually capturing Constantinople itself in 1453. Constantinople, the great city on the Bosphorus, the city that had been the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years, fell to Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II on a May morning in 1453. The city would be renamed Istanbul, though the name Constantinople continued to be used for many years. The Ottoman sultans took on the role of caliphs, leaders of the Sunni Muslim world, after the conquest of Egypt from the Mamluks in 1517. The Sultan in Istanbul now held both political and religious authority over an enormous and diverse empire. Life within the Ottoman Empire was, for most of its long existence, organised around a system that allowed a degree of religious and cultural autonomy. Christians, Jews, and other non-Muslim communities were organised into millets, self-governing communities that managed their own religious affairs and personal law. It was not equality, in the modern sense. Non-Muslim subjects paid additional taxes and faced various restrictions. But it was a system that for centuries allowed very different communities to coexist within the same imperial structure. Istanbul under the great Ottoman sultans was a city of minarets and domes, of covered bazaars and quiet gardens, of boats crossing the Bosphorus in the morning light. The Topkapi Palace sat on the promontory where Europe meets Asia, its courtyards layered one inside another like the chapters of a long, slow book. The covered bazaar of Istanbul, the Grand Bazaar, was built in the 15th century and is still in some form operating today. Thousands of shops under a vaulted roof, organised by trade, the jewellers here, the carpet merchants there, the spice sellers somewhere deeper in, where the air is warm and fragrant and slightly overwhelming. The sound of it, the low hum of voices, the clink of tea glasses on metal trays, the call of a merchant to a passerby, is the sound of 600 years of commerce, layered and accumulated. In Cairo, which the Ottomans controlled after 1517, the mosques and minarets of the medieval city rose above the streets in their dozens. The Al-Azhar Mosque and University, founded in 970, continued to function as a centre of Islamic scholarship throughout the Ottoman period, and still functions today, one of the oldest continuously operating universities in the world. Students came from across the Muslim world to study there, carrying their notebooks and their questions through the narrow lanes of old Cairo, past the smell of bread and coffee and dust. In Jerusalem, the Ottomans rebuilt the walls that still stand around the old city today. Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566, the longest reigning and arguably the greatest of the Ottoman sultans, ordered the walls constructed in the 1530s. They are made of pale limestone that catches the afternoon light and glows a kind of warm gold. People walk along the top of them now, looking out over the rooftops and the domes. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Ottoman Empire was in a long and complicated decline. European powers, Britain, France, Russia, Austria, were expanding their influence. The empire lost territory in Europe and North Africa. There were internal reform movements, some successful, some not. There were uprisings among various subject peoples who were beginning to think in the new European language of nationalism, the idea that people who share a language and a culture and a history should govern themselves. The Ottomans called their empire the sick man of Europe, or rather, the phrase was put in their mouth by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, who used it to describe what he saw as an empire on the verge of collapse. The phrase stuck. The 19th century brought wars in the Balkans, wars with Russia, wars with Egypt. It brought internal reforms called the Tanzimat, a word meaning reorganization, which aimed to modernize the empire's legal and administrative systems. New schools were built. Railroads began to extend across Anatolia. A telegraph system connected Istanbul to its far-flung provinces. There was a newspaper press in several languages. There were coffee houses in Istanbul where men read the papers and argued about politics, about constitutions, about what the empire was and what it could become. There was a generation of Ottoman intellectuals who were genuinely excited by the idea of reform, who believed that the empire could modernize without losing its essential character, that the old and the new could be held together. They were called the Young Ottomans, and later the Young Turks, and their ideas were a complicated mixture of Ottoman patriotism, Turkish nationalism, admiration for European liberalism, and anxiety about the empire's survival. It brought the abolition of the millet system in theory, and the promise of equal citizenship for all subjects regardless of religion. In practice, change was uneven. Tensions between communities that had coexisted for centuries, began to sharpen in this new atmosphere of nationalism and competition. And then came the First World War. The Ottoman Empire entered the First World War in 1914 on the side of Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a decision made by a small group of leaders over the objections of others. It was a decision that would prove catastrophic. The war brought fighting on multiple fronts, in Gallipoli, in Mesopotamia, in the Sinai and Palestine, in the Caucasus. British forces, working alongside Arab allies who had been promised independence in exchange for their support, pushed northward through Palestine and Syria. The First World War also brought one of the great atrocities of the 20th century. Beginning in 1915, the Ottoman government, controlled at this point by a group of leaders known as the Young Turks, ordered the deportation of the Armenian population of Anatolia. Armenian men were executed. Women, children, and the elderly were marched into the Syrian desert. They were killed in large numbers or died from exhaustion, starvation, and disease along the way. Estimates of those who died range from several 100,000 to well over 1 million. The word genocide, newly coined in the 20th century, has been applied to what happened to the Armenians by scholars, by many governments, and by international organizations. The Turkish government disputes the characterization. The argument over what to call it continues, and the Armenians who descended from survivors continue to live with its weight. The Arab Revolt, which began in 1916 and was coordinated in part by British officers, including a young man named T.E. Lawrence, aimed to undermine Ottoman authority in the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant. It was a campaign of raids and disruptions, of desert crossings and dynamited railway lines. Lawrence of Arabia, as he would become known, is one of those figures who occupies a complicated space in history. He was genuinely talented, genuinely committed to the Arab cause in some sense, and also genuinely a servant of British imperial interests, which were not always the same thing. He wrote about his experiences in a long, elegant, difficult book, and the gap between what he promised and what was actually delivered haunted him for the rest of his life. What the Arabs fighting alongside the British did not know the full extent of, was that British and French diplomats had already been meeting in secret to decide what to do with the Middle East after the war. Their names were Sykes and Picot. Mark Sykes was a British diplomat. François-Georges Picot was a French one. In 1916, they negotiated an agreement, secret at the time, revealed to the world only after the Russian Revolution of 1917, when the new Soviet government published the contents of the old Tsar's foreign archives. The Sykes-Picot Agreement divided the Arab territories of the Middle East into British and French spheres of influence, with lines drawn on a map in a way that had very little to do with the people who actually lived there. The lines cut across tribal territories, across regions that shared languages and traditions, across the natural geography of the land. The borders of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel and Palestine trace their origins, in various ways, to decisions made in rooms far from the Middle East, by men who had never been to most of the places they were drawing lines across. This is one of those quiet facts that carries a great deal of weight. Not because the men who drew those lines were uniquely villainous. They were doing what imperial powers of that era did, following the logic of power that governed the world they lived in. But because those lines are still there, countries still exist within them, people still define themselves in relation to them, conflicts still unfold along them. At roughly the same time that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was being negotiated, another letter was being written. In November of 1917, Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, wrote a letter to Walter Rothschild, a prominent figure in the British Jewish community. The letter expressed the British government's support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It was a short letter, just one paragraph, but it carried enormous implications. The question of a Jewish homeland had been under discussion in Europe for several decades, driven by a movement called Zionism that had grown in response to the persistent persecution of Jews in Europe, pogroms in Russia, discrimination across the continent, the slow accumulation of evidence that Jewish communities in Europe were not safe in the ways that other communities were safe. Theodor Herzl, an Austrian journalist who is often called the father of modern Zionism, had argued in the 1890s that the Jewish people needed a state of their own, a place that was unambiguously theirs, where they could live without fear of expulsion or persecution. He organised a series of Zionist congresses, wrote pamphlets and books, travelled and lobbied and worked with ferocious energy toward this goal until his death in 1904. What the Balfour Declaration did not fully reckon with was that Palestine was not an empty land. It had a population, predominantly Arab and Muslim, with significant Christian Arab and Jewish minority communities. These people had their own attachment to the land, their own sense of it as home, their own expectations about what the future might hold. The British, in this period, made promises to multiple parties that were difficult to reconcile with each other, and those contradictions did not stay in the realm of diplomacy. They moved, over the following decades, into the streets, into the fields, into the lives of real people. After the First World War ended in 1918, the Ottoman Empire was dismembered. The territory that had once been a single imperial structure was parcelled out under a League of Nations mandate system. Britain received mandates over Palestine, Transjordan and Mesopotamia. France received mandates over Syria and Lebanon. In the Arab world, this was experienced as a betrayal. The promises of independence that had accompanied the Arab revolt were not delivered. Instead, the old imperial powers simply reorganised their presence under a new name. In Iraq, the territory that had been Ottoman Mesopotamia, the British installed a Hashemite king, Faisal, who had briefly been king of Syria before the French expelled him. The new Iraqi state was a patchwork: Shia Arabs in the south, Sunni Arabs in the centre, Kurds in the north, and smaller communities of Christians, Yazidis, Jews and others throughout. It was held together by British-backed authority rather than by any organic political consensus. In the Levant, the French drew the borders of Syria and Lebanon with their own interests in mind, separating the coast, where Maronite Christians were a significant population, from the interior, and ensuring that no single Arab state would be large enough or cohesive enough to challenge French power in the region. In Palestine, the British mandate was from the beginning a delicate and deteriorating balance. Jewish immigration increased through the 1920s and 1930s, driven by persecution in Europe, by Zionist ideology, by the pull of a place that felt to those who came like the fulfillment of something ancient and essential. Arab Palestinians watched this immigration with growing alarm. Land was being purchased and settled. the character of towns and villages was changing. There were strikes, protests, and eventually, in the late 1930s, a full-scale Arab revolt against British rule and against Jewish immigration. The British responded with varying degrees of force and negotiated an uneasy series of agreements that satisfied no one entirely. They published a white paper in 1939 that severely restricted Jewish immigration to Palestine, at precisely the moment when Jews in Europe most desperately needed somewhere to go. The Holocaust changed everything. The systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people by the Nazi regime across the occupied countries of Europe between 1941 and 1945 was a catastrophe of a scale and deliberateness that is still difficult to fully comprehend. It gave the Zionist cause a moral urgency that had not existed before in quite the same form. It gave the world, or a significant portion of it, a reason to support the idea of a Jewish state in a way that had previously been contested. After the war, Jewish survivors and those who had already reached Palestine pressed harder than ever for statehood. The British, exhausted and overextended, found the situation in Palestine increasingly untenable. There was guerrilla violence from Jewish militant groups, protests, international pressure. The British handed the question to the newly formed United Nations. In November of 1947, the United Nations passed a resolution, Resolution 181, recommending the partition of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, with Jerusalem under international administration. The Jewish leadership in Palestine accepted the plan. The Arab states rejected it. On the 14th of May 1948, the British mandate officially ended and the State of Israel declared its independence. David Ben-Gurion, who would become Israel's first Prime Minister, read the Declaration of Independence in Tel Aviv. The following day, the armies of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Iraq and Lebanon entered the territory. The war that followed lasted until early 1949 and ended with armistice agreements rather than a formal peace treaty. Israel had not only survived but expanded beyond the boundaries that the UN partition plan had allocated. Large portions of the territory designated for an Arab state were either held by Israel or annexed by Transjordan. And the Palestinian Arab population, somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million people, had fled or been expelled from their homes. They left behind villages, orchards, houses, quays. They settled in refugee camps in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria. The camps were meant to be temporary. They were not temporary. This displacement, the Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe, is, for Palestinians, the central event around which much of their modern history and identity is organised. It is not, in most Israeli national narratives, given the same centrality. This gap in understanding, in acknowledgement, in what each side considers the relevant starting point, has made reconciliation enormously difficult in the decades since. And it is not a gap that is easy to close from a distance, or in a script like this one spoken softly into the darkness. It is only worth naming it, gently, as one of the silences that sits at the heart of this story. The new state of Israel was recognised quickly by the United States and the Soviet Union, an unusual moment of agreement between the two powers who were, in most other respects, already settling into the long cold standoff that would define the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War cast a long shadow over the Middle East. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were looking for allies in the region, and they found them on various sides of various conflicts. Israel aligned primarily with the United States, though the relationship took time to deepen fully. Egypt, Syria and Iraq at various points aligned with the Soviet Union, receiving weapons and economic support. Lebanon, in this same period, was navigating its own complicated equilibrium. The country had been designed, by the French, who had held the mandate, around a careful balance between its religious communities, Maronite Christians, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Druze and others. Political offices were distributed by community. The president would always be a Maronite, the prime minister a Sunni, the Speaker of Parliament a Shia. It was a system that worked, after a fashion, for a while. Beirut in the 1950s and 1960s became one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the Arab world, a place of universities and publishing houses, of cinemas and coffee houses, of intellectual debate and remarkable food. It was called the Paris of the Middle East, a comparison that was not entirely off the mark in those years. The Corniche along the seafront, the mountain resort of Brumana above the city, the old Ottoman-era neighbourhoods with their arched windows and terracotta tiles. The Palestinian refugee population that had come to Lebanon after 1948 complicated this equilibrium. Lebanon found itself drawn, against the will of many of its communities, into the orbit of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Armed Palestinian factions operated from Lebanese territory, drawing Israeli responses. The balance that the Lebanese system had maintained began slowly to tip. Oil, the vast reserves of crude oil that lay beneath the deserts of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, and other parts of the region, had become the defining resource of industrial modernity. The United States, Britain, and other Western powers had enormous economic interests in the Middle East that went beyond ideology. Control of oil, or at least secure access to it, shaped their foreign policies in ways that were not always stated openly. The region was, in the language of Cold War strategists, too important to leave to its own devices. Egypt, under President Gamal Abdel Nasser, became in the 1950s a symbol of a new kind of Arab political project, Arab nationalism, the idea that the Arab world should unite around a shared identity and throw off both the legacy of colonialism and the influence of foreign powers. Nasser was charismatic and genuinely popular across the Arab world. In 1956, he nationalised the Suez Canal, the waterway connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea that had been under British and French control. Britain and France, together with Israel, launched a military campaign to retake it. The United States, in an unusual move, opposed its own allies. The Eisenhower administration pressured Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw. They did. Nasser emerged from the crisis a hero. The Suez Crisis was a symbolic turning point, the moment when it became undeniable that the old European empires no longer held the same power they once had. But Arab nationalism, for all its energy, struggled to translate into durable political forms. The United Arab Republic, a short-lived union between Egypt and Syria that lasted from 1958 to 1961, dissolved over differences in governance and national interest. Nasser's project of pan-Arab unity remained more aspiration than reality. In June of 1967, in 6 days, everything changed again. The Six-Day War began on the 5th of June, when Israel launched preemptive strikes against Egyptian airfields, destroying a large part of the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. It was a precisely executed operation, born of genuine fear. Nasser had been making threatening statements and had moved troops toward the Sinai, and Israel's leaders believed an attack was coming. In 6 days, Israel defeated the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. It captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Jerusalem, the city that had been divided since 1948, was unified under Israeli control. Israeli soldiers reached the Western Wall, the last remaining structure of the ancient temple compound, and the moment was photographed and filmed and has been reproduced many times since. For Israel, the victory felt like a transformation, an expansion of territory, a sense of the country's power, a reunion with sites that carried deep historical and religious significance. For the Arab world, it was a humiliation. The scale of the defeat was almost incomprehensible. Armies that had trained and prepared and been equipped by the Soviet Union had been defeated in less than a week. The territories Israel now controlled, the West Bank, Gaza, the Sinai, the Golan Heights, would shape every subsequent event in the region's history. In 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, catching Israeli forces off guard. The initial advances were significant. Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal and pushed into the Sinai. Syrian forces advanced into the Golan Heights. Israeli forces regrouped and eventually turned the tide. The United States airlifted military supplies to Israel. The Soviet Union supplied Egypt and Syria. It was the Cold War, conducted through proxy armies in desert sand. The war ended after several weeks with a ceasefire. The territorial changes were modest, but the psychological impact was enormous on all sides. Egypt had restored some of its dignity. Israel had been reminded of its vulnerability. And the oil-producing Arab states, led by Saudi Arabia, had responded to American support for Israel by cutting off oil exports to the United States and other Western countries. The oil embargo sent shockwaves through Western economies. Long lines at petrol stations in the United States, energy shortages in Europe, the sense that the Middle East could affect daily life in faraway countries in immediate and painful ways. The price of oil quadrupled. Western governments began, slowly and uncertainly, to think about energy independence and alternative sources of fuel, but not enough changed, and quickly enough, to reduce the West's fundamental dependence on Middle Eastern oil. In 1978, in a place called Camp David in the mountains of Maryland, the United States hosted a summit between the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. 13 days of negotiations produced the Camp David Accords, the framework for the first peace treaty between Israel and any of its Arab neighbours. In 1979, Egypt and Israel signed a formal peace treaty. Israel withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt recognised Israel's right to exist. Sadat was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, alongside Begin. He was also, within the Arab world, deeply unpopular for what many felt was a separate peace, a deal that left the Palestinian question unresolved and broke Arab solidarity. In 1981, he was assassinated by members of an Islamist militant group while reviewing a military parade in Cairo. The peace between Egypt and Israel has held, in a formal sense, ever since. It is sometimes called a cold peace. The governments cooperate, the borders are open, but the warmth of genuine reconciliation has never quite arrived. It sits there, useful and functional, like a treaty that was signed in a room and never quite made it out of the room and into the streets. In Iran, in 1979, something else entirely was happening. The Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had been on the throne since 1941 and had, since a CIA and British intelligence-backed coup in 1953, ruled with American support. He had modernised Iran in certain respects, building infrastructure, educating women, industrialising. He had also built a feared secret police called SAVAK, suppressed political opposition, and accumulated enormous personal wealth while many of his subjects remained poor. Resentment had been building for years, and in the winter of 1978 and 1979, it reached a breaking point. Mass protests swept the country. Students, workers, the religious establishment, liberal intellectuals, leftists, all united temporarily by their opposition to the Shah. The Shah fled in January 1979. He was ill, and he left his country for the last time. In February, an elderly cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini, who had been living in exile in Paris, returned to Iran. He was greeted by crowds of millions. An Islamic Republic was declared. A new constitution was drafted with Khomeini as the supreme leader, a title that placed religious authority at the apex of political power. The Iranian Revolution was a genuinely surprising event, not predicted by most foreign governments, not easily categorized by the existing frameworks of Cold War ideology. It was not a communist revolution. It was not a liberal democratic revolution. It was something new, or rather something very old presented in a new and potent form. The United States was deeply rattled. Iran, which had been a key American ally in the region, was now governed by forces profoundly hostile to American influence. And then, in November 1979, a group of Iranian students stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 66 American diplomats hostage. The hostage crisis lasted 444 days. It ended only on the day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president, a coincidence that has generated decades of speculation and controversy about what negotiations may have taken place behind the scenes. The revolution in Iran alarmed the Arab states of the Gulf, particularly Saudi Arabia and the smaller monarchies. They feared, not without reason, that Iran's revolutionary zeal would spread, particularly among Shia Muslim populations across the region. Iraq, under its president Saddam Hussein, was also watching Iran with anxiety. Saddam, who had consolidated power through the Ba'athist Party and a state security apparatus of considerable ruthlessness, saw an opportunity in the apparent chaos of post-revolutionary Iran. In September 1980, Iraq invaded Iran. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 years. It was one of the most destructive conflicts of the 20th century, and one of the least remembered, perhaps because it unfolded far from Europe and North America, and because both sides were, for different reasons, somewhat inconvenient for Western governments to talk about too clearly. The United States, fearing an Iranian victory, quietly supported Iraq, providing intelligence, agricultural credits, and looking the other way as Iraq acquired weapons and eventually chemical weapons that it used both against Iranian forces and against its own Kurdish population in attacks of devastating scale. Both sides settled into a grinding attritional conflict that recalled, in certain terrible ways, the First World War. Trenches, mass infantry assaults, artillery bombardments, very little territory gained or lost. By the time it ended in 1988, perhaps 1 million people had died. The borders were almost exactly where they had been in 1980. Saddam Hussein emerged from the Iran-Iraq War with an enormous military force and an enormous debt, much of it owed to Kuwait, which had supported Iraq financially during the war. He wanted Kuwait to forgive the debt. Kuwait declined. In August 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait and declared it the 19th province of Iraq. The international response was swift and, by the standards of such things, broadly unified. The United Nations passed resolutions condemning the invasion and authorizing the use of force. An American-led coalition was assembled, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, and other Arab states alongside European and other allies. It was a coalition of unusual breadth. In January 1991, the Gulf War began with an air campaign of extraordinary intensity, followed in February by a ground offensive that drove Iraqi forces from Kuwait in 100 hours. Coalition forces stopped at the Iraqi border. They did not move to remove Saddam Hussein from power. The decision was deliberate. The coalition's mandate was to liberate Kuwait, not to invade Iraq, and there were concerns shared by several Arab members of the coalition about what would happen if the Iraqi state collapsed. What happened instead was something in between. Saddam remained in power. Kurds in the north and Shia Muslims in the south, who had risen up against him during the war, were brutally suppressed. Sanctions were placed on Iraq that endured for over a decade and had devastating effects on ordinary Iraqis, and Saddam remained, in the minds of American policymakers, unfinished business. Through the 1990s, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict moved into a new phase, one that seemed for a moment to offer genuine possibility. The Oslo Accords, signed in 1993 on the lawn of the White House, were the result of secret negotiations between Israeli and Palestinian officials held in Norway. Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli Prime Minister, shook hands in front of Bill Clinton, who spread his arms wide as if to embrace the moment. The Accords established a framework for Palestinian self-governance in parts of the West Bank and Gaza, and set out a timeline for negotiating the final issues: borders, the status of Jerusalem, the question of Palestinian refugees, the settlements that Israel had been building in the occupied territories since 1967. The final status negotiations never succeeded. There were too many issues on which the gap between the sides was too wide. The settlements kept growing, changing the facts on the ground. Rabin was assassinated in 1995 by a Jewish Israeli extremist who opposed the peace process. The Second Intifada, a period of intense Palestinian armed resistance and Israeli military response, began in 2000 and brought years of bombings, shootings, military operations, closures, and grief on all sides. The Gaza Strip, after Israel's withdrawal of settlements and military forces in 2005, came under the control of Hamas, a militant Islamist organization that did not recognize Israel's right to exist. The Gaza Strip became a sealed territory, a narrow strip of land on the Mediterranean coast, densely populated, subject to a blockade that restricted the movement of people and goods. Lebanon, meanwhile, had descended into a civil war of its own, a civil war that began in 1975 and lasted 15 years, drawing in Palestinian armed groups, Syrian forces, Israeli forces, American and French peacekeepers, and dozens of Lebanese militias organised along religious and political lines. The war killed perhaps 150,000 people, displaced hundreds of thousands more, and left Beirut, that cosmopolitan, sunlit city, divided by a green line running through its heart, with snipers on buildings that had once been apartments and hotels, and streets where no one walked. The civil war ended imperfectly with the Taif Agreement of 1989. The country rebuilt with a particular energy. The old centre of Beirut was reconstructed, the seafront reopened, the restaurants and bookshops returned. But the underlying tensions were never fully resolved. Hezbollah, the Shia militia and political party backed by Iran, had emerged during the civil war as a major force and never disarmed. Lebanon carried its contradictions forward, precariously, into the next century. The question of Palestine, of what it means, of who has the right to what, of where borders should be drawn and what should happen to those who were displaced in 1948 and their descendants, remained at the end of the 20th century exactly as unresolved as it had been at the beginning of it. In September 2001, in New York and Washington, and a field in Pennsylvania, the attacks that are known simply by their date changed the direction of American foreign policy for a generation. The attacks were carried out by 19 men, most of them Saudi citizens, organised by Al-Qaeda, a militant Islamist network led by Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden was at the time based in Afghanistan, under the protection of the Taliban government. The United States invaded Afghanistan in October 2001, removing the Taliban from power and pursuing Al-Qaeda across the mountains and deserts of that long-troubled country. And then, in March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The stated reasons were that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons, and a possible nuclear program, and had links to Al-Qaeda. The intelligence that underpinned these claims was, it would emerge, flawed, in some cases fabricated, and in some cases presented to the public in ways that emphasized certainty where uncertainty existed. No weapons of mass destruction were found. The link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda was not established. The invasion toppled Saddam Hussein's government in weeks, but the aftermath was something different entirely. The Iraqi army was disbanded, the Ba'athist state structure was dismantled. A country of 25 million people, holding together communities that had lived in uneasy proximity for decades, was left with a sudden, vast institutional vacuum. Into that vacuum came violence, insurgency, sectarian conflict between Sunni and Shia communities, fueled by long-standing grievances and the deliberate choices of armed groups who wanted conflict rather than reconciliation. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died, millions were displaced. The country's infrastructure, its electricity, its water, its schools and hospitals, was damaged or destroyed. The American military presence, which had imagined itself as a liberating force, found itself in a grinding and confusing counterinsurgency for which it was not well prepared. It would not fully withdraw until 2011. The Iraq War of 2003 and its aftermath fundamentally reshaped the region in ways that are still unfolding. The removal of Saddam Hussein did not produce the stable, democratic Iraq that its architects had imagined. Instead, it produced a country whose communities, held together for decades by the force of authoritarian rule, found themselves with old grievances, new weapons, and no functioning institutions to contain the violence that followed. One of the quieter consequences of the Iraq War was what it did to the neighbourhood. Iran found itself with enormous new influence in Iraq, as Shia political parties backed by Tehran won elections in Baghdad. The fear of Iranian expansion that had partly motivated American support for Saddam in the 1980s had been realised, paradoxically, by the war that removed him. Syria found itself hosting millions of Iraqi refugees in the years after 2003. Jordan too. The human consequences of the war flowed outward across borders, changing the demographics and politics of the region in ways that had nothing to do with the stated rationale for the invasion. And in the prisons where insurgents were detained, Abu Ghraib in Iraq, facilities in Syria and elsewhere, men who might otherwise never have met were brought together, politicized, radicalized, and in some cases organized. The conditions that produced the Islamic State were, in part, the conditions created by the 2003 invasion and its aftermath. It is a chain of cause and effect that is uncomfortable to trace, but it is there if you follow it. In 2010, a street vendor in Tunisia set himself on fire. Mohamed Bouazizi was 26 years old. He had been selling vegetables from a cart to support his family. A municipal official had humiliated him, had slapped him, had confiscated his cart, had refused his appeals, and he had stood in front of a government building and set himself on fire. He died from his injuries in January 2011. The protests that followed in Tunisia grew into a revolution that removed the country's president of 23 years. And that wave did not stop in Tunisia. It moved across the Arab world with a speed that astonished everyone. What was remarkable about the early days of the Arab Spring was not just the scale of the protests, but their texture. In Tahrir Square in Cairo, people brought their families. They camped overnight. They organised committees to manage the space, to collect rubbish, to maintain order. There were doctors and lawyers and students and factory workers and grandmothers. There was an atmosphere of something that felt, to those who were there and to many who watched from a distance, like possibility. The chants were simple. The signs were handmade. The social media posts moved quickly from phone to phone, from country to country, carrying the same images of crowds and raised hands, and the same feeling that something was shifting that had seemed unmovable for decades. Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Bahrain. Protests, uprisings, revolutions. Some peaceful, some not. The Arab Spring, as it came to be called, seemed for a moment to promise something. A new kind of politics in the region, driven by ordinary people rather than by foreign powers or ruling dynasties. In Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, who had governed for 30 years, was removed. The crowds in Tahrir Square celebrated through the night. In Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, who had governed for 42 years, was killed by rebel forces after a NATO-backed military campaign that had intervened to protect civilians and ended up facilitating regime change. In Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, who had governed for 33 years, stepped down, though Yemen's troubles were only deepening. And in Syria, a protest movement that began peacefully in the city of Deraa in March 2011 was met with force by the government of Bashar al-Assad. Security forces opened fire on protesters. People were arrested and tortured. The crackdown turned protests into armed resistance. Armed resistance became a full-scale civil war. The Syrian civil war became one of the most catastrophic conflicts of the early 21st century. By the time of its most intense phases, the country had fractured into a patchwork of territories controlled by the government, by various rebel groups, by Kurdish forces, and by a new and extraordinarily violent organisation that called itself the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, or ISIL, or Daesh. The Islamic State had emerged from the ruins of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, from the insurgency and the sectarian violence that had followed the 2003 invasion. In 2013 and 2014, it expanded rapidly across northern Iraq and eastern Syria, declaring a caliphate, a restoration, it claimed, of the Islamic State that had existed in the early centuries of Islam. The organisation was extraordinarily brutal in its methods, executing prisoners, enslaving Yazidi women, destroying ancient artefacts and archaeological sites, governing the territories it controlled with a rigid and violent interpretation of religious law. An international coalition launched airstrikes against the Islamic State. Kurdish forces on the ground in Syria and Iraq did much of the fighting. By 2019, the Islamic State had lost its territorial caliphate, though as an organisation and an ideology, it continued to exist in dispersed form. Syria remained devastated. Estimates of deaths in the Syrian civil war range from 300,000 to 500,000. Half of the country's pre-war population, around 12 million people, had been displaced, either internally or as refugees in neighbouring countries and Europe. The ruins of Aleppo, once Syria's largest city, were photographed from above and looked like the photographs of European cities bombed in the Second World War. In Yemen, the Arab Spring's aftermath settled into a different kind of slow catastrophe. The country, already one of the poorest in the Middle East, descended into a civil war between a Saudi-led coalition supporting the internationally recognised government and Houthi forces, a Shia-aligned movement from the country's north, backed by Iran. The war in Yemen produced what the United Nations described as one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Famine, cholera, the collapse of health infrastructure, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people from violence, disease and malnutrition. The suffering unfolded largely out of sight, reported on but not widely felt in the places where the reporting was consumed. And this perhaps is one of the quiet tragedies of distance, that things can be happening in great and terrible detail in the lives of real people. Children who are hungry, hospitals that have run out of medicine, cities that have no running water, and somewhere else those things can be known about but remain somehow abstract, removed. The way a photograph of a mountain is not quite the same as the mountain itself. The history of conflict in the Middle East, if we have to call it that, if we have to give it a label, is not really a history of conflict alone. It is a history of wheat and water and trade routes, of languages and alphabets and calendars, of religions that ask people to be better than they often are, of empires that built extraordinary things and also caused extraordinary suffering, of borders drawn by people who did not live within them. It is a history of cities, Baghdad, Cairo, Jerusalem, Istanbul, Beirut, Damascus, that have been inhabited for millennia, that have burned and been rebuilt, that hold within their stones and streets the sediment of everything that has ever happened to them. Walking through an old city at dusk, you can feel the weight of that, the way the light falls on old walls at a particular angle, the sound of a call to prayer echoing off the stones, the smell of bread from somewhere nearby. Damascus is said to be the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, though this is a claim several other cities also make, and the argument among historians is gentle and ongoing. But there is no question that people have lived in Damascus for a very long time, that the streets of its old quarter, the Medina, the covered souk of Hamidiyeh with its vaulted iron roof, the Umayyad Mosque with its mosaics of green and gold, have been walked by Arameans, by Greeks, by Romans, by Byzantine Christians, by Arab Muslims, by Crusaders, by Mongols, by Ottomans, by French soldiers, by merchants and scholars and ordinary people going about their days. A city like that accumulates something. It is not exactly memory. Cities do not remember in the way that people remember, but the stones do hold a kind of record. The layers are physical. You can dig down through the floors of an old building and find the floors of the building that came before it, and the floors of the building before that, and on until you reach the original earth. Jerusalem is the same. Below the current streets lie streets from the Crusader period, and below those Byzantine streets, and below those Roman streets, and below those the streets of the Second Temple period, and below those older things still. The city is not flat. It is layered, deep, almost inexhaustibly full of what came before. There is a way of thinking about the conflicts of the Middle East that focuses only on the surface, on the events of the last 100 years, on the borders and the wars and the political arguments that fill the news, and those things matter enormously to the people living through them. But there is another way of looking, which is to step back, very far back, and see the whole long sweep of it. 6,000 years of cities and empires and ideas and prayers, of wheat and trade and the sound of water in an aqueduct, of clay tablets and manuscripts and radio broadcasts and smartphone cameras. To see the conflicts not as a fixed and permanent condition, but as the most recent surface of something very, very old and very, very human. People have been building and destroying and rebuilding in this part of the world for longer than almost anywhere else on Earth. The destruction is real. The rebuilding is also real. It is a history of ordinary life, interrupted again and again by forces larger than any individual, and continuing anyway. People getting up in the morning and making breakfast, and going about their days in a place that the rest of the world keeps framing as a problem to be solved. It is a history that is not finished. It is unfolding right now, in ways that are difficult to understand and impossible to predict. The lines drawn on maps in the early 20th century are still there, still contested. The questions about land and belonging and self-determination that were not answered in 1948 have not been answered since. The gap between what different communities believe about their own history and what other communities believe about that same history remains wide and real. But there is also this, that people keep living, that markets keep opening in the morning, that bread keeps being baked, that children keep being born into ancient cities and learning to walk in alleyways worn smooth by thousands of years of footsteps. That somewhere in the Middle East right now, a woman is hanging laundry in the late afternoon light, and the breeze is coming in off the sea, and the sheets are warm from the sun, and she's watching a bird settle on a rooftop nearby. And for a moment, just that moment, everything is very still. This is a long story. It is still being written. But for tonight, this is where we will leave it. In that moment of stillness, in the warmth of the sun on old stone, in the smell of bread and the sound of a city settling toward evening. Let the weight of all that history rest for a while. Let it settle gently, like dust motes drifting in a shaft of light. You have been listening to something very old and very complicated, and you did not have to solve any of it. You only had to be here for a little while, and let it wash past you like a slow, wide river. The river is still there, moving in the dark, and you can sleep now.